Hey guys, it's me. It's Miss Checka. I'm sorry I'm a little late. The laptop is in the laptop hospital still, so getting the old laptop to work is a little bit of work. But I still had not chosen a new book to read, and I was a little kind of on the fence with some of the ones that we read last week. And I still have a whole bunch at my house from my classroom that I haven't peeked in. So thought we'd do some more new chapters. Unless somebody has strong feelings, and you can tell me. So some of the ones I wanted to do in the next couple of days are Little Women, which I love so much. It's one of my all-time favorite books. I know it looks massive, but first of all, it's actually 2 books in one. Second of all, the type is really big. And third of all, if you like it, there's a very, very good movie adaptation on this one that is out right now. It's so good. There's a million different adaptations of this book. This is one of my favorite books when I was a kid. Another one is The Evolution of Calpurnia Tea. I don't know anything about this one. Ordinary Princess. I don't know anything about it, but it's short. Esperanza Rising. I read a snippet of this book many years ago. And also, I did not bring home any kid poetry books, but this is a book of poetry that I just like. So I thought maybe we could read 1 or 2 of these poems. But anyway, let's see what's going on with Calpurnia Tate. So this is by Jacqueline Kelly. And I like the cover because this is silhouette cut paper art. And I really love cut paper art. Look at it. This is one of those things like accordions that strangely you just see in a lot of different cultures. So like the Germans do a lot of cut paper art. The Poles do a lot of cut paper art. In Mexico, there's a ton of cut paper art. Papel picado, that's what that is. Except that kind is not usually done with scissors. That kind is usually done with a chisel and a hammer. Did you know that? When you go to Mexico or you go to like a Mexican place and you see the flags that are with real thin tissue paper, first of all, when it's tissue paper, it's done by hand. It's called papel picado, and it's hammer and chisel. There's also a very, very famous American artist named Kara Walker, and she does cut paper art. It's very provocative. It's very interesting. Okay. Anyway, that's why I like the cover. I also like to do cut paper art. All right, so let's see. Chapter 1, The Origin of Species. That already has my attention because The Origin of These Species is a very, very famous book written by Charles Darwin. Okay. When a young naturalist commences the study of a group of organisms quite unknown to him, he is at first much perplexed to determine what differences to consider, for he knows nothing of the amount and kind of variation to which the group is subject. So this is like a quote. By 1899, we had learned to tame the darkness but not the Texas heat. We arose in the dark hours before sunrise when there was barely a smudge of indigo along the eastern sky and the rest of the horizon was still pure pitch. We lit our kerosene lamps and carried them before us in the dark like their own tiny wavering suns. There was a full day's work to be done before noon when the deadly heat drove everyone back into our big shuttered house, and we lay down in the dim, high-ceiling rooms like sweating victims. Mother's usual summer remedy of sprinkling the sheets with refreshing cologne lasted only a minute. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was time to get up again. The temperature was still killing. Ooh, wow. This book already gets me because it is extremely hot in Texas right now, and that's exactly what I've been doing, afternoon naps. It's too hot in the afternoons. The heat was a misery for all of us in Fentress, but it was the women who suffered the most in their corsets and petticoats. Ooh, I would not want to be wearing a corset in this weather. I was still a few years too young for this uniquely feminine form of torture. They loosened their stays and sighed the hours away and cursed the heat and their husbands too for dragging them to Caldwell County to plant cotton and acres of pecan trees. Mother temporarily gave up her hair pieces, a crimp's false fringe, and a rolled horsehair rat, platforms on which she daily constructed an elaborate mountain of her own hair. On those days when we had no company, she even took to sticking her head under the kitchen pump and letting Viola, our quadroon cook, pump away until she was soaked through. We were forbidden by sharp orders to laugh at this astounding entertainment. As Mother gradually surrendered her dignity to the heat, we discovered, as did Father, that it was best to keep out of her way. Hold on a second. Let me see when this book is published. 2009. Okay. Well, let me explain a word here. The word quadroon. So the U.S. has a very, very long history of slavery in it. Like, it was not something that lasted for 5 minutes. It was something that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And because that history is so long, it also means that there's generations and generations and generations of white people and Black people who had children together. Except most of the time it was white men, like white slave owners, having children with women who had no choice in the matter. And one thing that made American slavery kind of uniquely bad in the history of slavery is that you could be born into it. So in other instances, like, slavery is always bad. It's like a bad thing to own other people. But in other instances in world history, like for instance, the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks, or the ancient Egyptians, when they had slavery, it would be temporary. Like, let's say you and I fight a battle against each other and I win the battle. And so the soldiers that are on the other side, I just take those soldiers and then I make them slaves. So it would be, first of all, like, a lot of times as men, not always, but, and those slaves could sometimes earn money in different ways. They could get their freedom, they could earn their freedom, and then that's it. Like, they wouldn't be slaves anymore. And definitely, like, if they had kids, the kids were just normal people, not slaves. But in the US, we had a system where, like, it doesn't matter who both your parents are. Like, if one parent is free and the other parent is a slave, you're a slave. So if both of your parents are slave, you're a slave. If one of your parents is a slave and that parent is your mom, you're a slave. If one of your parents was the slave owner, you're a slave. So that's pretty ugly. And they they considered, like, yeah, if you're Black, you're a slave. So that meant that, like, even if only one of your grandparents out of all of your grandparents was Black, that meant that you also were Black. So they came up with all of these terms and words to, like, specify the percent that somebody was Black. So a quadroon is, I believe, somebody who was like 1/4 Black. Today, we don't do that. That's a real ugly way to be thinking about other people. That's a real ugly way to be thinking about yourself. Like, people are not fractions. People are just people, right? So you can ask somebody, like, hey, how do you identify? And they'll tell you, they'll tell you what race or ethnicity they are, if you're friends with them, right? But we wouldn't say, like, well, because you are 1/8 this or 1/9 that, I'm going to give you, like, a special name. Okay. So I looked to see when this book was published, because the fact that they used that word without explaining it made me think, like, maybe it's an old-timey book, but it's not that old-timey. It's 2009. Okay. Going back to the book. My name is Calpurnia Virginia Tate, but back then everybody called me Callie V. That summer, I was 11 years old and the only girl out of 7 children. Can you imagine a worse situation? I was spliced midway between 3 older brothers, Harry, Sam Houston, and Lamar, and 3 younger brothers, Travis, Saul Ross, and the baby, Jim Bowie, whom we called JB. So I know I keep interrupting. I may not get very long in this book. But number one, I just want to point out, since it says that it's 1899, I just wanted to be clear that even though like Octoroon is a name that comes out of slavery, there would be no slaves anymore in 1899 because the Civil War had already been gone for many, many decades. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that we can really, really, really tell that this is a Texas family because the names of the kids are like Sam Houston and Lamar, or Texas presidents. Jim Bowie and W.B. Travis were both men. I believe Jim Bowie for sure died at the Alamo. I think W.B. Travis did too. Saul Ross was a Texas Ranger who fought against Native Americans. He was not a very pleasant person. But anyway, these are like heroes of Texas history. The little boys actually managed to sleep at midday, sometimes even piled atop one another like damp, steaming puppies. The men who came in from the fields and my father back from his office at the cotton gin slept too, first dousing themselves with tin buckets of tepid well water on the sleeping porch before falling down on their rope beds as if poleaxed. Yes, the heat was a misery, but it also brought me my freedom. While the rest of the family tossed and dozed, I secretly made my way to the San Marcos riverbank and enjoyed a daily interlude of no school, no pestiferous brothers, and no mother. I didn't have permission to do this exactly, but no one said I couldn't. I got away with it because I had my own room at the far end of the hall, whereas my brothers all had to share, and they would have tattled in a red-hot second. As far as I could tell, this was the sole decent thing about being the only girl. Our house was separated from the river by a crescent-shaped parcel of 5 acres of wild, uncleared growth. It would have been an ordeal to push my way through it, except that the regular river patrons, dogs, deer, brothers, kept a narrow path beaten down through the treacherous sticker burrs that rose as high as my head and snatched at my hair and pinafore as I folded myself narrow to slide by. When I reached the river, I stripped down to my chemise, floating on my back with my shimmy gently billowing around me in the mild currents, luxuriating in the coolness of the water flowing around me. I was a river cloud, turning gently in the eddies. I looked up at the filmy bags of webworms high above me in the lush canopy of oaks bending over the river. The webworms seemed to mirror me, floating in their own balloons of gauze in the pale turquoise sky. That summer, all the men except for my grandfather, Walter Tate, cut their hair close and shaved off their thick beards and mustaches. They looked as naked as blind salamanders for the few days it took to get over the shock of their pale, weak chins. Strangely, grandfather felt no distress from the heat, even with his full white beard tumbling down his chest. He claimed it was because he was a man of regular and moderate habits who never took whiskey before noon. His smelly old swallowtail coat was hopelessly outdated by then, but he wouldn't hear of parting with it. Despite regular spongings with benzene at the hands of our maid San Juana, the coat always kept its musty smell and strange color, which was neither black nor green. Okay, I don't know. This could be a good book. I'm having trouble getting into it. Let's see what the back says. Summer of 1899 is hot in Calpurnia's sleepy Texas town, and there aren't a lot of good ways to stay cool. Her mother has a new wind machine, but instead, Callie's contemplating cutting off her hair one sneaky inch at a time. She's also spending a lot of time at the river with her notoriously cantankerous grandfather, an avid naturalist. But just when Callie and her grandfather are about to make an amazing discovery, the reality of Callie's situation catches up to her. She's a girl at the turn of the century, expected to cook and clean and sew. What a waste of time. Will Callie ever find a way to take control of her destiny? Okay. All right. So this is one book. Mhm. All right. Um, let's do. Let's see here. Should we do a little ordinary princess, or should we do a Little Women? I think a little ordinary princess, because this is kind of light and fun. All right. This is by MMK, and let's see when this is published. 1980. Okay. So it is not super old, but it's not brand new either. Okay. How it began. Long and long ago, when Oberon was king of the fairies, there reigned over the fair county of Phantasmorania a monarch who had 6 beautiful daughters. They were in every way all that real princesses should be, for their hair was as yellow as the gold that is mined by the little gnomes in the mountains of the north. Their eyes were as blue as the larkspurs in the palace gardens, and they had complexions like wild rose petals in cream. I feel obligated to point out that that would make sense in some countries, but not in others. Well, there's Tess. Hi, Tess. The royal mama, the queen, was very proud of them, and they all had extremely grand christenings when they were babies. She called them all after precious stones and was often heard to refer to them playfully as my jewels. Their names were diamond, opal, emerald, sapphire, crystal, and pearl. Every princess wore a golden crown set with the jewels of her first name, so you can imagine the excitement in the city of Fanf, which is the capital of Phantasmorania, when the news leaked out that Messieurs Hybendix and Piphorn, goldsmiths and silversmiths, by appointment to His Majesty King Hildebrand, had been commissioned to make another crown, and this time to set it with amethysts. So, there is going to be a 7th princess at the palace, exclaimed the housewives of Fanf. That is as it should be. A 7th daughter is always lucky, cackled the oldest inhabitant. A 7th princess, sighed the romantic maidens. And of course, she will be the most beautiful of all. Youngest princesses always are. How lucky she will be, and oh, how lovely to be a princess, thought the school children, looking enviously across the roofs of the town to where the tall towers and pointed turrets of the royal palace of Fanf rose high above the treetops. How do you know it won't be a prince this time? Asked the travelers stopping at inns and taverns of the city. But the townspeople and the innkeepers and the hosts of the taverns only laughed and said, "It is plain you are strangers to the country. Our royal family always has princesses." "But you have a king," objected the travelers. "Oh, yes, but by tradition, the heir to the throne is always the youngest son of the eldest princess. It's very simple." And so, upon a lovely spring morning, when the primroses were gold in the forest afar away, and the woods were white with wild cherry blossom, the great bronze cannon on the palace walls, which is only fired at the birth of a royal baby, boomed out on the still air. And as the first puff of smoke broke from the walls and the first boom rang out over the city, the townspeople stopped their work, and housewives, shopkeepers, and schoolchildren all ran out together into the streets. Every eye was turned to the palace. Boom! Rang out the cannon. Boom! Boom! 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, counted the townsfolk. 20! A princess! They cried. And they threw their hats in the air and cheered while the bells of all the churches in the city rang a merry peal, and a general holiday was declared in honor of the occasion. In a rich and splendid room high up in a turret of the palace, the cause of all the excitement and rejoicing lay in a golden cradle and blinked at the carved ceiling. The 7th princess really was the loveliest baby imaginable. She was no bigger than one of her sister's dolls, but she was as pink and white and gold as the apple blossoms and the spring sunshine, and her eyes were as blue as the sky above the forest of far away. Her nurses and ladies in waiting never tired of admiring and exclaiming over her many perfections, and from the first she was a very good-natured baby. She never cried or screamed, but would lie on her back and smile at the sunbeams dancing on the ceiling, or sleep for hours on end. Had a very grand nursery for such a very small person, for the ceiling was all carved and painted with the legends of the forest of Faraway, and the walls were hung with amethyst-colored tapestry. The floor was spread with silken carpets, and the seventh princess had no less than 12 attendants, all her own. First, there was her nurse, Marta, then 3 under nurses, 2 ladies in waiting, 4 nursery maids, and 2 pages. Sometimes the pages would play on the flutes and viols while the ladies in waiting sang lullabies to hush the seventh princess to sleep. When she was 6 weeks old, preparations were begun for an especially grand and splendid christening. Hundreds of clerks sat at ivory desks all day, writing out invitations with gold ink on parchment. Hundreds of pages heated gold sealing wax to seal the envelopes. And hundreds of the king's messengers put spurs to their horses and rode away east and west and north and south to deliver them to the invited guests. The list of invitations was so long that it took the Lord High Chamberlain from before breakfast until after supper time to read it, while the roll it made was so large that it took 6 men at arms to carry it. There had been a long debate in council over the advisability of inviting fairies to the christening. The king had been against it from the first, but he had ended by being overruled by the queen, who had been backed up by the prime minister and the Lord High Chamberlain and a large majority of the councillors. Okay, we're out of time, but I'm going to show you this illustration. I guess this must be the Lord Chamberlain, and this must be one of the pages, and this is the guest list to her party. This is not a socially distant party, huh? All right, y'all. So that's it for today. So eat your fruits and vegetables, and I'll see you soon. All right, bye, guys.